Imagine standing at the height of an empire's power, its armies unstoppable, its influence stretching across continents. Now picture it all crumbling, not from a single battle lost or a natural disaster, but from whispers in shadowed corridors, secret handshakes between enemies, and alliances so covert they were erased from history books. This isn't fiction. It's the untold story behind some of the greatest collapses the world has ever seen. From Rome's legendary fall to the sudden disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, what if these weren't accidents of history, but carefully orchestrated takedowns? Behind every empire's demise, there's a web of hidden pacts, betrayals, and power plays stories of ambition so cunning they reshaped the world. Think about the last time you studied history. Chances are you learned about wars, treaties, and great leaders. But what about the secret alliances that operated in the shadows, the ones that turned allies into traitors and rivals into co-conspirators? These aren't just footnotes, they're the missing pieces that explain how empires that seemed invincible were brought to their knees. Picture this, a group of powerful figures meeting in secret, their loyalty not to a crown or a nation, but to a shared goal of rewriting the world order. These weren't random acts of betrayal. They were calculated moves in a game of power few even knew was being played. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on these shadowy networks, the secret alliances that toppled empires. This isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how power really works then and now, because the same forces that shaped history are still at play today, hidden in plain sight. Over the next few minutes, we'll uncover the covert deals, the unlikely partnerships, and the shocking betrayals that changed the course of civilizations. You'll see history in a whole new light, and you might just start questioning the stories you've been told. Ready to dive into the shadows? Let's begin. A secret alliance isn't just a handshake behind closed doors. It's a deliberate, invisible thread woven into the fabric of history. Unlike public treaties, signed with pomp and ceremony for all to see, these were agreements buried so deep that even some of the participants didn't know the full picture. They thrived on ambiguity, on the unspoken understanding that loyalty could be bought, sold, or twisted to serve a higher goal. So why would empires, with all their visible power, resort to such shadowy tactics? Sometimes it was survival. A looming threat on the horizon forced rivals into uneasy cooperation. Other times it was pure ambition, the chance to expand territory or undermine a common enemy without risking open war. And then there were the moments when secrecy wasn't just convenient. It was the only way to ensure the plan wouldn't unravel before it began. Take the Habsburgs, one of history's most powerful dynasties. Their empire stretched across Europe, but their real strength lay in a web of invisible alliances. Trusted intermediaries carried coded messages between courts, their words meaningless to anyone who intercepted them. Spies posed as merchants, diplomats, even clergy, gathering intelligence and forging connections under the guise of ordinary business. The Habsburgs didn't just rely on armies, they mastered the art of influence, turning minor nobles into silent partners and rival factions into unwitting pawns. But here's the catch: the same secrecy that protected these alliances also made them fragile. A single defector, a misplaced letter, or a change of heart could collapse years of planning in an instant. The rewards immense. A well-timed secret pact could topple a rival throne or secure a disputed border without a single battle, but the risks were just as staggering. Betrayal wasn't just possible, it was inevitable, because in a world where trust was currency, everyone had a price, and when the balance of power shifted, yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's executioner. That's the paradox of these hidden networks. They built empires, but they also sowed the seeds of their destruction, because in the end, no secret stays buried forever. Constantinople stood as the jewel of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, its massive walls repelling invaders time and again. But in 1453, those walls finally crumbled, not just from the Ottoman cannons pounding the gates, but from a web of secret betrayals that had been spinning for decades. Behind the scenes, Venetian merchants, supposed allies of Byzantium, had been quietly striking deals with the Ottomans, trading vital supplies for exclusive trade rights in the conquered city. Even as Byzantine emperors pleaded for help from Europe, these merchants were calculating that a fallen Constantinople could be far more profitable under Ottoman control. Then came the Dangers of Mercenaries, hired to defend the city's weakest point. On the night of the final assault, they mysteriously abandoned their posts, leaving a critical section of the wall undefended. Historians long assumed it was cowardice or disorganization, until letters surfaced centuries later. These documents revealed that key Dangers commanders had been secretly negotiating with the Ottomans, exchanging safe passage and future privileges for their betrayal at the decisive moment. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a carefully orchestrated collapse from within. The most damning evidence lies in overlooked treaties between Venice and the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II. While publicly denouncing the invasion, Venetian diplomats were privately assuring Mehmed they wouldn't interfere so long as their warehouses and trade routes were spared. Some records even suggest Venetian spies provided the Ottomans with maps of Constantinople's defenses. The Ottomans didn't just conquer the city, they exploited divisions that had been nurtured in shadows for years. This wasn't unique to Byzantium. The same pattern repeated in empires from ancient Persia to Napoleonic France, public shows of strength masking private vulnerabilities, where a handful of well-placed traitors could achieve what entire armies couldn't. Because the greatest threat to any empire isn't the enemy at the gates, but the allies who stop believing in its future. And once that faith is lost, even the mightiest walls are just stone waiting to fall. Mercenaries were the wild cards of ancient empires, professional soldiers with no homeland to defend, only a price to be paid. Their swords could turn the tide of battle, but their loyalties were always negotiable. The Byzantine Empire learned this the hard way with their elite Varangian Guard, fearsome warriors recruited from Scandinavia. On paper, they were the emperor's personal protectors. In reality, their allegiance often followed the heaviest purse. There's a reason Byzantine rulers kept these mercenaries close. They were both the empire's shield and its greatest potential threat. A whispered bribe or a promise of plunder could turn them from bodyguards into kingmakers overnight. Then there's the curious case of General Belisarius, the Byzantine military genius who reclaimed vast territories for Emperor Justinian. Officially, he was the empire's most loyal commander, yet whispers persisted that he'd secretly negotiated with Goth and Persian enemies, playing a dangerous double game to secure his own power. Whether true or not, the rumors alone exposed a chilling truth. Even the most celebrated heroes could be running shadow agendas. Empires didn't just fear enemy armies, they feared their own hired blades. This wasn't unique to Byzantium. Renaissance Europe's Swiss mercenaries were so notoriously pragmatic that the phrase, "no money, no Swiss," became a grim joke among kings. French monarchs hired them as royal guards, only to watch in horror as those same soldiers later defected to higher bidders during wars of succession. The lesson was clear: outsourcing violence to men without stakes in your survival was like handing a stranger the keys to your treasury. Fast forward to today, and the pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. Private military contractors operate in global conflict zones, their allegiances tied to contracts rather than causes. Like the Varangians or Swiss guards before them, they are indispensable until the day their interests diverge from those who hired them. History shows us that when empires rely on soldiers of fortune, they're not just buying protection, they're gambling on the one thing no amount of gold can guarantee: loyalty. Money has always been the silent architect of empires, but sometimes it became their executioner too. While armies clashed on battlefields, another war raged in trading houses and banking halls, where ledgers and loans could bring kingdoms to their knees. The Dutch East India Company didn't just trade spices, they orchestrated a financial siege against Portuguese colonies in the 17th century. By controlling key shipping routes and flooding markets with cheaper goods, they didn't just compete, they suffocated Portugal's economy from within. Local merchants, lured by better prices, quietly shifted allegiance, draining Lisbon's wealth one transaction at a time. This wasn't conquest by cannon fire, it was collapse by spreadsheet. Then there were the embargoes, invisible blockades that starved empires of resources. When the Medici Bank cut off loans to rival city-states, entire governments found themselves paralyzed. No gold meant no armies, no alliances, no way to pay the very officials keeping the state running. The Medicis, posing as neutral financiers, held strings that could yank thrones sideways. A withheld loan here, a sudden call for repayment there, these weren't accidents. They were calculated moves in a game where debt was the deadliest weapon of all. Currency manipulation turned money into a Trojan horse. In 16th century Spain, counterfeit coins minted by rivals infiltrated the economy, eroding trust in the very system that funded the empire's global ambitions. Prices spiraled, soldiers went unpaid, and the silver galleons arriving from the Americas couldn't keep up with the financial rot spreading at home, the real coup. No one even knew who'd planted the sabotage until it was too late. The lesson echoes through history. Financial elites didn't just fund wars, they picked winners. When the Fugger family bankrolled Habsburg emperors, they weren't just investors, they were kingmakers. A single ledger entry could mean the difference between a coronation and a coup. Today's stock markets and central banks might seem worlds apart from those shadowed counting rooms, but the playbook hasn't changed. Control the money, and you control the fate of nations without ever drawing a sword. The Habsburgs didn't conquer Europe with swords alone, they wielded wedding rings like diplomatic weapons. For centuries, this dynasty turned marriage contracts into secret treaties, stitching together an empire not through battles, but through carefully orchestrated unions. Let others wage war, their motto went, "You, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did, into thrones from Spain to Hungary, Burgundy to Bohemia. But behind the pomp of royal weddings lay clauses so consequential they redrew maps. A single marriage contract could quietly transfer entire provinces, demand future military alliances, or even stipulate that grandchildren inherit rival kingdoms. These weren't just romantic unions, they were corporate mergers of statecraft with dowries paid in territory and bloodlines. Take the infamous marriage of Philip the Fair to Joanna of Castile. Publicly, it united Spain and Habsburg lands. Privately, the contract contained a bombshell. If Joanna's parents died without male heirs, Castile would pass to Habsburg control. When that exact scenario unfolded, it catapulted the dynasty from regional power to global empire overnight. Yet the same strategy that built their dominance sowed the seeds of collapse. Obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure, Habsburgs intermarried so relentlessly that by the time Charles II took the Spanish throne, his family tree was more of a tangled knot. His infamous health issues, epilepsy, infertility, a jaw so deformed he couldn't chew, weren't just personal tragedies. they were the empire's genetic reckoning. Letters between Habsburg rulers reveal a chilling paradox. Even as they preached family loyalty, they distrusted their own kin. Philip II of Spain wrote frantic notes about his son Don Carlos, whose erratic behavior he blamed on tainted blood. Meanwhile, Austrian Habsburgs whispered that their Spanish cousins were reckless with power. The dynasty's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, became its fatal flaw. When revolts erupted in the Netherlands or nobles in Hungary rebelled, relatives who should have sent help often hesitated, calculating whether crushing dissent might weaken their own branch of the family. The echoes of this strategy linger today, from political dynasties grooming heirs for office to conglomerates merging through marriages of convenience. Power still flows along invisible kinship lines. Modern elites might not inbreed like the Habsburgs, but they still guard access to inner circles with what one historian calls soft eugenics, prestigious schools, exclusive clubs, and carefully curated social networks that replicate old aristocratic gatekeeping. The lesson: dynasties that confuse blood with loyalty often find both running thin, because in the end, no amount of royal weddings can substitute for real trust or shield an empire from its own contradictions. Religion was never just about faith, it was also about power, and nowhere was this clearer than in the secret dealings that shattered the Holy Roman Empire. On the surface, the Protestant Reformation was a spiritual revolution, a challenge to the Vatican's authority. But peel back the layers, and you'll find a hidden network of political alliances that turned theological debates into empire-breaking weapons. German princes, hungry for independence from Rome, didn't just embrace Luther's ideas, they weaponized them. In smoky backrooms, these rulers struck deals with reformers, offering protection in exchange for legitimacy. The printing press spread Luther's words, but it was whispered promises between nobles and preachers that turned those words into a rebellion. Then came the Council of Trent, the Vatican's grand counterattack against Protestantism. Officially, it was about religious purity. Unofficially, a masterclass in political maneuvering. Behind closed doors, papal diplomats negotiated with Catholic monarchs, trading doctrinal concessions for military support. Spain's Philip II received secret assurances that crushing Dutch Protestants wouldn't just please God, it would earn him papal backing for his own imperial ambitions. Meanwhile, the Jesuits, founded as soldiers of the faith, became something far more potent: the Vatican's intelligence network. Dispatched to royal courts across Europe, these scholar priests doubled as advisors, spies, and power brokers. A Jesuit confessor whispering in a king's ear could sway policy as effectively as an army at the gates. The irony: these religious alliances often backfired spectacularly. When Catholic France secretly funded Protestant German princes to weaken the Habsburgs, they didn't just destabilize their rivals, they unleashed forces that would eventually fuel their own revolutions. Ideology, it turned out, was a double-edged sword. Fast forward to today, and the playbook hasn't changed. Modern alliances still cloak strategic interests in moral rhetoric, whether it's superpowers backing insurgents or corporations funding activist movements. The lesson of the Reformation isn't just about faith, it's about how easily ideals become tools in the hands of those playing the long game. Because when power and belief collide, the fallout reshapes worlds. The ink on Europe's colonial treaties often dried before the locals even knew what they'd signed. Take the Berlin Conference of 1884, where 14 powerful men gathered around a map of Africa, a continent none of them had ever set foot in, and drew lines that would dictate millions of lives. The official records speak of civilizing missions and free trade, but the real agreements happened in hushed conversations over brandy. Private letters between diplomats reveal the truth. Africa wasn't divided for progress, but to prevent European powers from stumbling into war over it. They called it the Scramble for Africa, but it was more like a backroom auction with human futures as the currency. Then came the treaties, documents so manipulative they'd make a modern lawyer blush. Local rulers, many illiterate in the languages of the contracts, were told these papers promised protection or trade. In reality, they often signed away sovereignty with an X. The British Empire's treaty with the Lowsy King in 1890 claimed he'd voluntarily placed his country under Her Majesty's protection. His advisors later testified the translator had whispered it was merely a friendship pact. Similar stories played out from the Niger Delta to the Malay Peninsula, where rulers discovered too late that their signatures had turned homelands into corporate concessions. But the most insidious deals were the ones never written down. French and Belgian agents operated under a tacit understanding. Whichever power could bribe or bully local chiefs fastest got the territory. German colonial officers in Namibia kept two sets of books, one for Berlin's audits, another tracking the actual exploitation. And when rebellions erupted, like the Hero Uprising of 1904, these same powers quietly coordinated to crush dissent, sharing intelligence while publicly denying any collaboration. Resistance, though, had its own hidden networks. The Maji Rebellion in German East Africa wasn't just a spontaneous revolt. It was coordinated through a secret system of water priests who passed messages in sacred codes. In India, the Chain of Freedom linked underground printers distributing anti-colonial literature from Bombay to Bengal, their presses hidden in basements and coconut groves. These movements understood what their oppressors knew all too well. Real power moves in whispers before it ever marches in boots. The colonial archives are filled with frantic telegrams about unrest and disloyalty. But read between the lines and you'll find the truth. Empires feared nothing more than the moment the silenced started speaking to each other. Because history's greatest irony is that the same secret tactics used to build empires often taught the oppressed how to dismantle them. The Haitian Revolution didn't begin with a battle cry. It started with whispers in sugarcane fields after dark, where enslaved Africans and free people of color forged alliances so dangerous that discovery meant torture or death. On the surface, these groups were divided by law and circumstance, but in hidden meetings they recognized a shared truth. Freedom wasn't a gift to be granted, but a future to be seized. The revolution's architect, Toussaint Louverture, was once a trusted coachman for plantation owners. That very trust gave him access to intelligence, the movements of colonial officials, and the ability to move between plantations without suspicion. His network wasn't built on weapons, but on something far more powerful: shared knowledge passed through work songs with coded lyrics, or messages tucked into baskets of laundry delivered between estates. Then came the grapevine telegraph, an intricate system of communication that outmaneuvered French surveillance. Enslaved fishermen carried news between coastal plantations under the guise of trading catches. Market vendors relayed updates through seemingly innocent proverbs. Even children playing in courtyards became couriers, their games masking the exchange of vital information. When the final uprising erupted in 1791, it wasn't a chaotic riot, it was a synchronized strike across hundreds of plantations, timed to the hour. The French never saw it coming because they'd underestimated the power of people who weren't supposed to be able to read, write, or organize. But secrecy came at a cost. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 revealed how easily underground networks could unravel. Sepoy soldiers passed lotus flowers and chapatis as symbols of revolt, a brilliant tactic, until British informants infiltrated their ranks. Some were bribed, others threatened with exposure of their families. the rebellion's leaders, like the legendary Nana Sahib, discovered too late that their most trusted aides had been turned. Betrayal didn't just weaken the uprising, it gave the British Empire a roadmap to dismantle it, village by village. Today's grassroots movements still grapple with these same tensions. From encrypted messaging apps used by activists to evade government surveillance, to the double agents who infiltrate protest groups, the dance between secrecy and exposure hasn't changed. What has evolved is the scale where once a single informant could doom a plantation revolt. Now a leaked screenshot or hacked email chain can expose entire networks. Yet the core lesson remains: oppression thrives on division, and the most dangerous alliances are the ones that bridge those divides, because when the silenced find ways to speak to each other, empires start listening and trembling. The Cold War wasn't fought just in missile silos or at summit tables. It unfolded in the quiet corners of embassies, in the coded transmissions of double agents, and in the fragile alliances that could shift global power with a single defection. Take the Cino-Soviet split, a fracture so seismic it redrew the Cold War's battle lines overnight. Publicly, Moscow and Beijing stood as communist brothers. Privately, their rivalry was a tangle of sabotage and betrayal. Soviet advisors sent to China in the 1950s weren't just there to help. They were gathering intelligence, assessing Mao's loyalty, and quietly siphoning resources back to Moscow. When Mao realized the extent of the deception, the fallout was explosive. Secret memos revealed Chinese operatives began leaking Soviet military secrets to the West, not out of ideological sympathy, but to cripple their so-called allies. It was a masterclass in how quickly shared enemies could become bitter rivals when trust dissolved. Then there were the CIA's shadow wars, where alliances were as fluid as the conflicts they fueled. Declassified documents show the agency funneling weapons to Afghan mujahideen through Pakistani intelligence, all while knowing those same guns might one day turn against them. In Angola, American operatives partnered with apartheid South Africa's security forces to back anti-communist rebels, an unholy pact that would have sparked outrage if exposed. These weren't partnerships built on ideals, they were marriages of convenience where yesterday's war criminals became tomorrow's assets because the enemy of my enemy was temporarily worth arming. The KGB played an even darker game. Their active measures strategy turned diplomacy into a minefield. One declassified file details how Soviet agents groomed rising politicians in newly independent African nations, offering bribes disguised as development grants and blackmail material disguised as friendship. By the time these leaders realized they were puppets, their governments were already packed with KGB informants. The real genius: Moscow often let local communists take the blame while their own operatives stayed in the shadows. But the fragility of these schemes was their undoing. A 1983 CIA report admitted their Nicaraguan Contra allies were uncontrollable and corrupt, burning villages they were paid to protect. KGB files lament how their prized East German spies grew greedy, demanding luxury cars instead of ideological devotion. These weren't stable alliances, they were time bombs disguised as handshakes. Today's cyber wars follow the same playbook, just with keyboards instead of dead drops. Russian hackers lease malware to North Korean operatives. American tech firms quietly collaborate with intelligence agencies to patch vulnerabilities or exploit them. The tools have changed, but the game remains. Build alliances when useful, betray them when necessary, and always, always keep the receipts. Because in the world of shadows, the only true loyalty is to the next move. Julius Caesar's assassination wasn't just a burst of political violence. It was the climax of a shadow war waged in plain sight. The senators who stabbed him that day in 44 BC weren't unified ideologues. They were bitter rivals who'd secretly agreed on one thing: Caesar had to go. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Plutarch paint the conspiracy as a noble act to save the Republic, but dig deeper, and you'll find alliances so unlikely they defy logic. Take Cassius, a hardened military man who despised Caesar's populism, teaming up with Brutus, the dictator's own protege. Their letters, preserved in fragments, reveal a chilling pragmatism. They didn't trust each other, but they needed each other's networks. Cassius brought the disgruntled soldiers, Brutus lent moral legitimacy. Together, they wove a web of collaborators so broad that even Caesar's friends kept silent, sensing the tide was turning. Then there's the Pisonian conspiracy against Nero, a plot so layered it reads like a spy novel. At its heart wasn't just anger over Nero's tyranny, but a calculated bid by aristocrats, poets, and even the emperor's own bodyguards to replace him with the nobleman Piso. Tacitus records how conspirators used poetry recitals to pass messages, embedding assassination plans in verses about Greek tragedies. But the real shocker: Nero's own wife, Poppaea, may have known about the plot. Some historians argue her sudden death, officially from a miscarriage, was actually a quiet execution after Nero uncovered her complicity. The question isn't whether these coups were planned, but how many others we've missed. Take the fall of Emperor Vitellius in 69 AD, dismissed as chaotic infighting until researchers noticed a pattern. Key defections happened simultaneously across his army, suggesting coordinated betrayal. Or the whispered deals before Alexander the Great's death, where generals suddenly switched loyalties after mysterious midnight meetings. Even the Rosetta Stone, celebrated as a linguistic breakthrough, hints at hidden alliances. Its text celebrates Ptolemy V's victory over rebels, but temple records show priests brokered secret pardons to stabilize his reign. What makes these conspiracies so enduring isn't their secrecy, but their blueprint. They follow a rhythm. First, the disillusioned elite identify a common enemy. Next, they exploit access, the trusted advisor, the overlooked guard, the spouse with private influence. Finally, they manufacture a moment of chaos to mask their coup as inevitability. Sound familiar? Because while togas and scrolls belong to the past, the playbook survives. Modern coups still rely on these three acts. Just swap poison for propaganda and daggers for disinformation campaigns. The lesson: when history calls an uprising spontaneous, look for the hands pulling strings in the wings. The Silk Road wasn't just a route for spices and silk, it was a labyrinth of hidden deals where merchant guilds operated like shadow governments. While emperors collected taxes at official checkpoints, these traders carved detours through deserts and mountains, their caravans loaded with contraband tucked beneath legal cargo. The Sogdians, masters of this underground economy, didn't just move goods, they moved power. Their encrypted ledgers, written in scripts only guild elders could decipher, recorded not just profits but bribes to border guards, payoffs to rival clans, and even loans to bankrupt nobles. A single ledger page could topple a regional governor or spark a trade war, all without a single sword drawn. Take the Tang dynasty's collapse in the 9th century. History books blame peasant revolts and corrupt officials, but dig deeper and you'll find the guild's fingerprints everywhere. When the Tang raised taxes to fund wars, the Sogdians simply rerouted entire trade networks, starving the treasury of silver. Silk meant for the emperor's warehouses vanished into hidden bazaars, sold to Arab merchants for untaxed gold. Even the dynasty's famed paper money, the world's first government-issued currency, was undermined by guild-backed counterfeits so convincing they flooded markets and crashed the economy. The Tang didn't just lose control of its borders, it lost control of the very wealth that sustained its power. The guild's most ingenious tactic, the phantom caravan. Official records might show a merchant transporting 100 bolts of silk, but in reality, only 10 were declared. The rest traveled as invisible cargo, smuggled in compartments beneath camel saddles or disguised as pilgrims' baggage. Some traders even bribed imperial inspectors to lose shipment records, creating legal gaps where goods could vanish without a trace. These weren't petty thefts, they were systemic leaks, draining empires one undeclared bolt at a time. Modern black markets operate on the same principles. Just as Sogdian traders exploited gaps between empires, today's shadow networks thrive in jurisdictional gray zones, dark web marketplaces, cryptocurrency mixers, and shell companies that mimic the Silk Road's encrypted ledgers. The difference scale, where a Tang-era smuggler might divert a few tons of tea, a modern trafficking ring moves billions in untraceable goods through algorithms instead of camels. But the goal remains unchanged, to build wealth outside the system, eroding empires from the edges in. Because whether it's silk or Bitcoin, the real currency of shadow networks has always been trust and the willingness to break it. The Barbary corsairs didn't just materialize from the shadows of the Mediterranean. They were bankrolled by empires playing a double game. While European monarchs publicly condemned piracy, their treasuries quietly financed these raiders to weaken rivals. The Ottoman Empire, for instance, granted the corsairs official letters of marque, turning them into a de facto naval force that harassed Spanish and Italian ships without Istanbul ever declaring war. Ports like Algiers and Tunis became hubs of covert empire building, where stolen goods funded Ottoman expansion while keeping their hands technically clean. But here's the twist: the Ottomans weren't the only ones playing this game. Leaked correspondence from the Vatican archives reveals that Spanish agents occasionally bribed corsair captains to attack Ottoman vessels, creating a chaotic web where pirates became pawns in a proxy war no one would admit existed. England mastered this art of plausible deniability with privateers like Francis Drake. Crown-sanctioned pirates, they called them licensed to plunder Spanish galleons under the flimsy guise of private enterprise. Queen Elizabeth I publicly distanced herself from Drake's raids, but her ledgers told a different story. She secretly invested in his voyages, taking a cut of the loot while maintaining diplomatic cover. When Drake returned from circumnavigating the globe in 1580, his ship, the Golden Hind, wasn't just laden with stolen Spanish gold. It carried secret maps of Spanish ports, intelligence that would later help England cripple Philip II's armada. The real prize wasn't the treasure, it was the leverage. Naval blockades turned this shadow warfare into economic strangulation. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's orders in council didn't just restrict French trade, they weaponized global shipping lanes. By declaring neutral ships fair game if they traded with France, the British turned merchants into unwitting combatants. Insurance rates skyrocketed, ports emptied, and Napoleon's empire began starving for supplies. Yet the blockade's true genius lay in its exceptions. British officials quietly granted permits to select neutral traders, creating a black market they could control. Some historians argue this wasn't just about isolating France, it was about redirecting Europe's wealth into London's coffers while pretending to enforce wartime morality. The line between piracy and policy has always been blurry. Today's equivalent might be cyber privateers, hackers unofficially tolerated or even employed by states to disrupt rivals without attribution. Just as Drake's exploits were celebrated with knighthoods while Spain fumed, modern digital raids often leave trails that lead to dead ends. The lesson: when empires want to wage war without declaring it, they still reach for the same tools: proxies, deniability, and the deliberate chaos of the unofficial. Because sometimes the most devastating attacks don't fly a flag at all. Economic warfare took this strategy to its logical extreme. After the British blockade, Napoleon retaliated with his continental system, an attempt to bankrupt England by banning European trade with them. But like all grand schemes, it crumbled under the weight of human ingenuity. Smugglers from Heligoland to Malta built clandestine networks, moving British goods under false papers or through bribed customs officials. Even Napoleon's own brother, Louis, King of Holland, secretly allowed the trade, recognizing his people's desperation for goods. The system's failure exposed a truth empires still grapple with. No decree can outmatch the collective cunning of those determined to survive. From the corsairs to the continental system, these tactics reveal a pattern. Real power isn't just about controlling armies, it's about controlling flows. Money, goods, information, who moves them, who interrupts them, and who profits from the chaos in between. Because in the end, the alliances that topple empires aren't always signed in treaties. Sometimes they're whispered in pirate dens, coded in ledgers, or buried in the unspoken rules of who gets to sail where, and who mysteriously disappears along the way. Catherine the Great didn't just collect art, she weaponized it. While her palaces filled with paintings and sculptures, a closer look reveals a subtle campaign to erode the Ottoman Empire's prestige. Take the famous allegory of the defeat of the Turks, commissioned by her court artists. On the surface, it's a celebration of Russian military victories. But hidden in the brushstrokes are deliberate humiliations. Ottoman leaders depicted with exaggerated features, their banners trampled underfoot, their symbols twisted into mockery. These weren't just battle scenes, they were psychological warfare, designed to circulate through European salons and plant the idea of Ottoman weakness in the minds of diplomats and traders. Opera houses became another front in this shadow war. When Mozart's The Abduction from the Seraglio premiered in 1782, its plot, a Christian woman escaping a Turkish harem, played perfectly into Catherine's narrative of Ottoman barbarism. What audiences didn't know was that Russian agents had quietly subsidized the production, ensuring its themes aligned with their geopolitical goals. Even the score carried coded insults. The Ottoman characters' music relied on clashing cymbals and shrill melodies, while the Europeans sang soaring, dignified arias. The message was clear: one culture was civilized, the other crude. This wasn't unique to Russia. Renaissance Italy's Medici family used art to legitimize their rule while undermining rivals. Botticelli's Adoration of the Magi secretly packed the faces of Medici enemies into the crowd as scowling bystanders, while family members basked in holy light. A single fresco could rewrite public perception, turning usurpers into saints and rivals into footnotes. Fast forward to today, and the tools have changed, but not the game. Modern cultural influence campaigns hide in plain sight. From blockbuster films subtly promoting national ideologies to streaming algorithms amplifying certain worldviews while suppressing others. Social media influencers, unknowingly or not, become pawns in larger battles, their viral trends echoing the Medici's curated imagery. The lesson: culture has always been a battlefield, just one where the weapons are brushes, notes, and pixels instead of bullets. And the empires that master this silent war often don't need to fire a shot. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was supposed to buy time for both sides. Signed in 1939 between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, its public clauses promised non-aggression. But the secret protocols carved up Eastern Europe like a butcher's diagram, assigning spheres of influence with cold precision. Stalin believed he'd outmaneuvered Hitler, securing buffer territories while the Nazis turned west. Hitler saw it as temporary theater, freeing him to crush Poland without Soviet interference. Neither truly trusted the other, both were just playing for position. What's chilling isn't that the pact collapsed, but how quickly it turned from alliance to annihilation. When German tanks rolled into Soviet territory less than 2 years later, they carried maps drawn during those very negotiations, maps Stalin had provided himself, detailing supply routes and infrastructure. The betrayal wasn't just strategic, it was psychological warfare, weaponizing the intimacy of their former partnership. This pattern of imploding alliances reveals a brutal truth: secrecy breeds paranoia. Take the Ottoman Empire's dealings with Crimean Khans in the 17th century. Ottoman sultans relied on these fierce cavalrymen to harass Russian borders, showering them with gold and titles. But intercepted letters show the Khans were simultaneously negotiating with Moscow, offering intelligence on Ottoman troop movements in exchange for safe passage. The Ottomans, sensing disloyalty, began embedding spies within the Khan's court, who then reported back that their own spies were being turned. The result? A feedback loop of suspicion where no action, no matter how loyal, could be taken at face value. The psychological toll of these games wore down even the most ruthless players. Cardinal Richelieu, architect of France's covert alliances during the 30 Years' War, left behind diaries filled with sleepless nights. One entry describes him interrogating a messenger for hours, convinced a slight hesitation in the man's voice meant he'd been bribed by Spain. Another confesses he could no longer distinguish real threats from imagined ones, writing, "Every shadow in the corridor becomes a dagger." Modern psychologists might diagnose this as chronic hypervigilance. The minds collapse under the weight of perpetual deception. Yet the greatest vulnerability of secret pacts isn't betrayal, it's miscalculation. In 1812, Napoleon assumed his alliance with Austria would hold as he marched on Russia. He didn't know Austrian diplomats had already secretly promised Tsar Alexander they'd stall their troops, a decision that left Napoleon's flank exposed. Likewise, the CIA's 1985 collaboration with Afghan warlords against the Soviets seemed airtight until those same warlords later harbored the very extremists America would spend decades fighting. The lesson echoes through history. When trust is built on shared interests rather than shared values, the moment those interests diverge, the knives come out. What's often overlooked is how these betrayals ripple beyond the powerful. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocols consigned millions in Eastern Europe to Soviet repression, then Nazi occupation, then Soviet rule again, all without their consent. Letters from Lithuanian families in 1941 described neighbors vanishing overnight as former allies settled scores through proxy purges. These weren't abstract geopolitical shifts. They were lived tragedies where the powerful played chess with human lives. Perhaps that's the darkest irony of shadow alliances. They promise control, but in the end, they make the world more unpredictable. Because when every handshake hides a dagger, no one, not even the dagger's wielder, can ever truly feel safe. History often paints women as bystanders to power queens who inherited thrones, wives who whispered in ears, or tragic figures swept along by men's ambitions. But dig deeper and you'll find a different story. Women who didn't just navigate the shadows of empire but built entire networks within them. Take Empress Dowager Cixi, the de facto ruler of China during its most turbulent decades. While textbooks reduce her to a conservative figure clinging to tradition, diplomatic cables tell another tale. During the Boxer Rebellion, as foreign troops marched on Beijing, Cixi didn't just resist, she played a double game. Publicly, she supported the anti-foreign Boxers. Privately, she sent secret envoys to European embassies, offering to suppress the rebellion if they'd guarantee her dynasty's survival. It was a masterstroke of realpolitik. By letting both sides think she was theirs, she bought time to maneuver. When the rebellion collapsed, Cixi emerged not as its instigator, but as the only leader capable of negotiating peace, a peace that, incidentally, left her firmly in power. Then there were the royal mistresses, dismissed as scandalous distractions but often acting as shadow diplomats. Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's famed companion, didn't just host salons, she brokered the Franco-Austrian alliance of 1756, a pact that redrew Europe's balance of power. How? By exploiting her unique position, too influential to ignore, yet technically unofficial, allowing her to float trial balloons in conversations no ambassador could risk. When Austria's envoy hesitated, Pompadour invited him to her private theater, where a carefully chosen play about Habsburg-Valois reconciliation softened him up for the real negotiation. The resulting alliance, which stunned Europe, was dubbed the Diplomatic Revolution, but its architect was a woman history would later reduce to a footnote. Even more striking were the women who operated without crowns or courts. Take Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, the 17th century African queen who outmaneuvered Portuguese colonizers for decades. When they demanded she sit on the floor during negotiations, she ordered a servant to kneel, creating her own throne. But her real genius lay in covert alliances, secretly arming rival tribes against the Portuguese, then posing as their protector to extract concessions. Her spies, many of them women disguised as traders, infiltrated enemy camps, relaying troop movements through market songs. By the time Lisbon realized she was playing both sides, she'd already cemented her kingdom's independence. The common thread: these women mastered what modern strategists call plausible deniability. Without official power, they could operate in ambiguities, hosting social gatherings that were really treaty talks, or sending personal letters that carried state secrets. Male rulers often dismissed them as trivial, only to find their empires reshaped by decisions made over tea or in bedchambers. And because their influence wasn't institutionalized, it left fewer traces, letting historians underestimate them for centuries. Today's parallels are everywhere, from corporate boardrooms where networking lunches mask power plays, to modern first ladies and advisors who broker backchannel deals. The game hasn't changed, just the players. The real lesson isn't that women were passive, but that their methods were so effective they had to be erased. Because when history remembers only the swords and treaties, it forgets the hands that held the pens and the whispers that moved them. Greek fire didn't just burn ships, it burned empires. The Byzantines guarded this incendiary weapon like a state secret, its exact formula known only to a select few. When enemies attacked Constantinople's walls, the Byzantines unleashed this nightmare fuel from bronze tubes, watching as flames clung to water and turned entire fleets to ash. The secret was so valuable that emperors reportedly executed anyone caught attempting to sell the formula. Yet somehow, by the Crusades, rival powers had cracked the code. How? Not through battle, but betrayal. A defecting engineer, a bribed official, or perhaps a merchant who smuggled a single vial to dissect history doesn't record the exact leak. But the result was undeniable. What once made Byzantium untouchable became just another tool in the arsenal of its enemies. Gunpowder followed a similar shadowy path. Chinese alchemists discovered it in the 9th century, initially using it for fireworks. By the 13th century, Mongol invaders had turned it into a weapon, thanks to captured engineers and defectors who traded knowledge for their lives. But the real twist came when European merchants, supposedly in China for trade, began smuggling out powder recipes hidden in cargo holds. Some disguised the formulas as medicinal texts, others memorized them and recited the ingredients to waiting scribes in Venetian backrooms. What took centuries to develop in one empire spread across continents in decades, reshaping warfare forever. The 19th century industrial espionage race proved even more cutthroat. British textile mills dominated global markets until an American named Samuel Slater, dubbed Slater the Traitor, memorized the designs of Richard Arkwright's spinning frames. Disguised as a farmhand, he boarded a ship to New England and rebuilt the machines from memory, kickstarting America's Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, German chemists infiltrated British dye factories, posing as workers while smuggling out formulas for synthetic pigments. These weren't just corporate secrets, they were national treasures, stolen not with guns but with fake identities and carefully folded blueprints. Today's cyber espionage follows the same playbook, just with keyboards instead of disguises. When a North Korean hacking group stole blueprints for advanced fighter jets, they didn't need to infiltrate a factory. They breached firewalls from thousands of miles away. Russian operatives allegedly targeted German steel plants not to sabotage them, but to steal proprietary metallurgy data that could give their own industries an edge. Even Silicon Valley's brightest startups have fallen victim to zero-day exploits, where vulnerabilities are hoarded like medieval alchemical recipes, sold to the highest bidder on dark web marketplaces. The irony, the very technologies meant to protect secrets, encryption, firewalls, biometric scans often become the tools used to bypass them. Just as Byzantine engineers never imagined their Greek fire would one day fuel Venetian warships, modern inventors rarely anticipate how their breakthroughs might be turned against them. Because in the end, knowledge never stays locked away forever. It follows the oldest rule of all: power flows where it's least expected, and the greatest empires aren't toppled by armies, but by the ideas they couldn't keep contained. Switzerland's pristine alpine peaks and crisp bank vaults have long symbolized neutrality, a nation untouched by war's chaos. But dig beneath the myth, and you'll find a far messier truth. During World War II, while Swiss officials publicly declared impartiality, their banks were quietly processing Nazi gold looted from occupied Europe. Declassified Allied intelligence reports reveal how German trains rumbled through Swiss tunnels carrying not just coal and machinery, but stolen art, jewelry, and even dental fillings from Holocaust victims, all melted down into untraceable bullion. The Swiss franc became the Third Reich's financial lifeline, a stable currency to buy vital tungsten and ball bearings from other, neutral suppliers. And when the war ended, those same banks stonewalled survivors' families for decades, hiding behind secrecy laws while sitting on fortunes stained with blood. Sweden's neutrality carried its own contradictions. On paper, they refused to join Hitler's war. In practice, their iron ore mines fed the German war machine right up to 1944, with shipments accounting for nearly half of Nazi steel production. Swedish factories supplied precision bearings for Luftwaffe planes, while diplomats quietly assured Berlin that Allied overflights would be discouraged. Only when Germany's defeat became inevitable did Stockholm finally halt the shipments, a timing that reeked less of principle than profit calculus. Even their humanitarian reputation had a shadow. While Sweden sheltered Jewish refugees, it also deported Baltic prisoners of war back to Soviet-controlled territories, knowing many faced execution. Portugal's dictator Salazar played both sides with chilling precision. His tungsten mines sold to the highest bidder, allies by day, Axis by night, while Lisbon's cafes became a spy's paradise, with agents from MI6 and the Abuela sipping the same espresso. The Azores, a Portuguese archipelago, were secretly leased to the Allies as an airbase, but only after years of extracting concessions. And let's not forget Spain's Franco, who postured as neutral while sending the Blue Division to fight alongside Nazis on the Eastern Front, all while negotiating US aid for his starving country. The dirty secret, neutrality was never about morality. It was a business model. These nations didn't avoid war, they monetized it, becoming arms dealers, bankers, and smugglers to both sides. Their survival depended on a delicate dance: give enough to keep predators at bay, but not so much that winners would punish them later. The Swiss didn't just survive Hitler, they thrived because of him, with banks swelling from Nazi deposits and arms factories running 3 shifts. Fast forward to today, and the game hasn't changed, just the players. Modern corporations tout ethical neutrality while selling facial recognition tech to dictatorships or data mining tools to rival governments. Cryptocurrency hubs position themselves as apolitical, yet their platforms launder money for cybercriminals and rogue states alike. Even entire nations still walk the tightrope. Gulf states broker peace talks while quietly fueling regional proxy wars, and tech giants pledge allegiance to no government until tax breaks or regulatory threats force their hand. The lesson buried in these histories is uncomfortable but clear. True neutrality is a fairy tale. In a world of interconnected power, there's no sidelines, only degrees of complicity. Because when the dust settles, the so-called neutrals aren't the ones who avoided the fight. They're the ones who made sure they got paid no matter who won. When the French flag was lowered over Africa in the 1960s, the world celebrated a wave of independence. But behind the triumphant speeches and handshake photos, a different story was unfolding. One where colonial powers didn't retreat so much as rebrand. Take the so-called France-Afrique system, a shadow network that kept former French colonies tethered to Paris long after their liberation ceremonies. On paper, these nations were sovereign. In reality, their economies, militaries, and even presidential palaces often answered to invisible strings pulled from Europe. French companies retained exclusive rights to key resources: uranium from Niger, cocoa from Ivory Coast, oil from Gabon, under contracts so lopsided they made colonial extraction look subtle. Behind these deals stood the Élysées African Cell, a secretive office in the French presidency that bypassed formal diplomacy to coordinate with compliant African leaders. Declassified cables reveal how Paris manipulated elections, backing coups against defiant presidents like Guinea's Sékou Touré while propping up loyalists like Gabon's Omar Bongo, who famously admitted, "Gabon without France is like a car without a driver." The real genius of neo-colonialism wasn't just economic control, it was plausible deniability. When protests erupted over France's stranglehold on the West African CFA franc, a currency pegged to the euro and printed in Paris, officials pointed to African central bankers as proof of local autonomy. Never mind that those bankers needed French approval to access their own reserves. Meanwhile, French military bases dotted the continent under defense agreements, ostensibly for mutual security. Yet when rebellions threatened friendly regimes like Chad's Hissène Habré in the 1980s, French paratroopers arrived not as peacekeepers but as regime bodyguards. Britain perfected its own version of post-colonial puppetry. In former colonies like Kenya, land redistribution after independence mysteriously favored British settlers who sold estates to politically connected locals, often with loans from London banks that kept them indebted for generations. And when Guyana's first elected leader, Cheddi Jagan, flirted with socialism in 1963, MI6 orchestrated strikes and riots to destabilize his government, then quietly backed a rival who reopened the country to British investors. The most insidious part, these systems outlived their architects. Today, multinational corporations and international financial institutions have inherited the playbook. Structural adjustment, loans from the IMF come with strings that force nations to privatize utilities or slash social spending, often benefiting the same former colonial powers that designed the terms. Mining contracts in the Democratic Republic of Congo still funnel profits to offshore shell companies, while local communities see little more than polluted rivers. What makes neo-colonialism so resilient is its ability to mask exploitation as partnership. The language changed as development replaced civilizing mission. Free trade stood in for extraction, but the outcome stayed eerily familiar. Because when power doesn't need flags or governors to maintain control, it becomes far harder to revolt against. The empires of tomorrow won't be built on conquered land, but on spreadsheets and silent agreements where the chains are digital, but the grip is just as tight. Burnt scraps of parchment and shattered clay tablets might seem like relics of the past until you realize they're smoking guns in history's coldest cases. Take the Linear B tablets discovered in the rubble of ancient Mycenaean palaces. At first glance, they were just inventory lists, counts of sheep, jars of olive oil, the mundane paperwork of a Bronze Age bureaucracy. But when linguists finally cracked the script in the 1950s, they uncovered something explosive: records of secret military shipments between kingdoms supposedly at war. One tablet from Pylos detailed weapons sent to the men of Knossos during a period when official histories claimed the two cities were bitter enemies. The truth, a shadow alliance hidden in plain sight beneath the dry language of accounting. Then there's the Vatican Secret Archives, a name that sounds like something from a thriller novel. In reality, it's a treasure trove of encrypted correspondence between popes and princes, where even the paper itself tells a story. Conservators recently analyzed letters between Queen Elizabeth I and the Ottoman Sultan Murad III, letters long dismissed as diplomatic niceties. But multispectral imaging revealed scorch marks from invisible ink, passages written in lemon juice that would have darkened when heated. The decoded sections showed Elizabeth proposing a joint naval strike against Spain, while Murad's scribes added margin notes speculating whether the Protestant queen could be trusted. These weren't just letters, they were blueprints for alliances too controversial to commit to plain parchment. The real game changer, modern chemistry. In 2019, scientists at the University of Copenhagen developed a technique to unburn ancient documents using X-ray fluorescence. When applied to a charred scroll from Herculaneum, a Roman town obliterated by Mount Vesuvius, it revealed a senator's private memo warning of a plot between Egyptian grain merchants and Praetorian guards to starve Rome into submission. The scheme failed, but the scroll's survival hints at how many other conspiracies might lie buried beneath volcanic ash or layered under medieval palimpsests. Perhaps the most tantalizing discoveries are the ones still out of reach. In the deserts of Central Asia, there's rumored to be a cache of Sogdian diplomatic letters sealed in clay cylinders, untouched for over a millennium. Satellite imagery shows what might be a Silk Road courier station near the Afghan border, its walls lined with pigeonholes that could hold hundreds of undelivered messages. And deep in the jungles of Cambodia, LiDAR scans have revealed a network of hidden tunnels beneath Angkor Wat, some lined with niches that might have once held scrolls exchanged between Khmer rulers and their shadowy vassals. What makes these fragments so electrifying isn't just the secrets they confirm, it's the patterns they suggest. Decoded letters from medieval Castile show identical phrases appearing in correspondence between nobles separated by decades, hinting at a shared cipher passed down through generations. Broken seals on Ming Dynasty tax records reveal where officials colluded to skim revenue, their wax impressions bearing tiny, deliberate flaws as a signal to co-conspirators. Even the spacing between words in Renaissance ledgers sometimes concealed acrostics, spelling out the names of bankers secretly funding both sides of a war. The greatest illusion empires ever crafted wasn't their invincibility, it was their transparency. We're taught to see history as a series of public treaties and declared wars, when in reality, the gears of power turned in whispers. Every shattered tablet or half-burnt letter is a crack in that illusion, proof that the real story was always written between the lines. And as long as there are ruins left to excavate and algorithms sharp enough to decode them, we're just scratching the surface of history's hidden alliances. Because for every secret we uncover, there are 1,000 more still waiting in the dark. History's shadow alliances aren't confined to dusty scrolls, they're alive and well in today's corridors of power. Consider the United Nations, where public votes on human rights or sanctions often mask private horse trading. A country might loudly condemn a rogue regime in the General Assembly, only to quietly approve arms sales to that same regime through backdoor channels. Declassified cables reveal how permanent Security Council members have traded favors for decades. Russia turning a blind eye to French interventions in Africa in exchange for muted criticism of its own territorial grabs, or China supporting watered-down climate resolutions to secure loopholes for its Belt and Road projects. The playbook hasn't changed since the Congress of Vienna, only the stage has. Corporate lobbying operates on the same clandestine logic. When a tech giant funds opposing political candidates in the same election, it's not confusion, it's hedging. Like the Medici bankrolling both papal factions during the Renaissance, modern conglomerates invest in all potential winners to guarantee influence, no matter who takes office. The recent leak of pharmaceutical industry memos showed executives celebrating pandemic-era legislation they'd helped draft, complete with provisions shielding them from liability. It's a stark reminder that when corporations whisper in lawmakers' ears, the resulting policies often echo their interests far more than the public's. The danger isn't just secrecy, it's the false sense of security these pacts create. Colonial powers once thought indigenous mercenaries would never turn on them, until those very forces led independence movements. Today, nations reliant on private military contractors face the same hubris. Reports from conflict zones describe contractors abruptly abandoning posts when contracts lapse, leaving strategic assets vulnerable. One minute they're your protectors, the next they're bidding on a contract with your rivals. The lesson: any alliance built on transactions rather than trust is one crisis away from collapse. Financial entanglements pose another modern parallel. Just as the Fugger family bankrolled emperors only to demand crippling repayments, today's sovereign debt traps follow a familiar script. Loans for infrastructure in developing nations come with strings, ports leased to foreign powers, mines sold to offshore shell companies. The difference: where past empires sent governors, today's wield spreadsheets. When Sri Lanka handed over Hambantota port to China after defaulting on loans, it wasn't conquest by cannon, but by contract, yet the loss of sovereignty was just as real. So how do we avoid repeating these patterns? Start by questioning the narrative spoon-fed to us. When a government claims there are no alternatives to an unpopular policy, remember how often that's been a smokescreen. The Iraq War wasn't the first conflict sold on fabricated intelligence. The Spanish-American War had its own, remember the main, moment. Scrutinize the language of inevitability. Phrases like economic realities or strategic necessities often mask backroom deals. The most powerful tool we have is transparency. Whistleblowers and investigative journalists today play the role of those medieval monks who secretly copied subversive texts, preserving truths the powerful tried to erase. From the Panama Papers exposing offshore tax havens to leaks revealing how autocrats exploit golden visa programs, sunlight remains the best disinfectant. Because history's greatest constant is this: the moment people start pulling threads, the whole tapestry of hidden power begins to unravel. Secrecy in diplomacy walks a razor's edge. Sometimes it saves lives, other times it sparks wars. During World War II, the Allies' covert intelligence sharing network, including breakthroughs like cracking the Enigma code, was undeniably ethical. These hidden collaborations shortened the war, sparing millions. British and American operatives worked in shadowy unison, passing decrypted Nazi messages through backchannels so sensitive that even many high-ranking officials were kept in the dark. The morality here seems clear. When silence protects the innocent and thwarts tyranny, it's not just justified, it's necessary. Yet contrast that with the tangled web of alliances that ignited World War I. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand wasn't just a lone anarchist's act. It was enabled by Serbia's shadowy Black Hand Society, whose members infiltrated military and government circles. Worse, their plot was tacitly tolerated by factions within Serbian intelligence, who saw the Archduke's death as a strategic win. Here, secrecy wasn't a shield for good, it was a weapon for chaos. The lesson: when covert pacts serve narrow agendas rather than collective survival, they don't just fail ethically, they backfire catastrophically. Modern examples blur the lines further. Consider whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, who exposed mass surveillance programs by revealing classified documents. Was his breach of secrecy a moral duty or a betrayal? Supporters argue he upheld democratic transparency. Critics insist he endangered lives. Similarly, corporate tech giants routinely sign non-disclosure agreements with governments, hiding data sharing practices from the public. Is that responsible security or unethical concealment? The answer often depends on whose ox is being gored. So where do we draw the line? Philosophers like Cicella Bock suggest a simple test. Does the secrecy serve a provable, immediate harm reduction, or is it merely consolidating power? The Allies' Enigma collaboration passes. It had measurable life-saving results. But when the CIA secretly backed coups in Guatemala or Iran during the Cold War, the long-term destabilization far outweighed any short-term gains. Secrecy, it seems, is like fire, a tool that can warm or destroy, depending on who holds it and why. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that we rarely know which category a covert pact falls into until it's too late. The Manhattan Project's scientists believed atomic secrecy would end wars. Oppenheimer later lamented the destroyer of worlds he'd helped unleash. Today, as nations race to cloak AI developments in classified vaults, we're left wondering, are we preventing catastrophe or planting the seeds of the next one? History offers no easy answers, only cautionary tales and the quiet hope that this time we'll choose wisdom over expediency. History is full of whispers in the dark, but not all of them turn out to be real. Take the infamous Priory of Sion, a secret society supposedly guarding the bloodline of Christ since medieval times. It's a story that's fueled best-selling novels and blockbuster films, until researchers discovered it was an elaborate hoax cooked up in the 1950s by a French con artist named Pierre Plantard. He forged ancient-looking documents, planted them in libraries, and even recruited a network of accomplices to lend credibility to the myth. For decades, the world believed in a shadowy cabal that never existed. The lesson: just because something sounds thrilling doesn't make it true. But here's where it gets tricky. Some secret alliances, once dismissed as wild conspiracy theories, turned out to be shockingly real. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, a series of illegal mind control experiments on unwitting citizens, sounded like science fiction until declassified documents proved it in the 1970s. Or consider the Tuskegee syphilis study, where US public health officials knowingly withheld treatment from black men for decades. These weren't myths, they were monstrous realities hidden behind official lies. So how do we tell the difference between a baseless rumor and a buried truth? The first clue is evidence, real, tangible proof, not just hearsay or vague, some say, claims. When historians uncovered the real backroom deals that toppled empires, they didn't rely on anonymous sources. They traced letters, financial records, and eyewitness accounts that all pointed in the same direction. The Medici banking empire's secret loans to rival city-states, proven by ledgers with ink chemically matched to 15th century Florence. The Ottoman-Venetian trade agreements that undermined Byzantium. Confirmed by multiple independent sources, from ship manifests to diplomatic correspondence, facts leave paper trails, hoaxes crumble under scrutiny. Another red flag is motive. Real conspiracies usually serve concrete goals: money, power, survival. The Habsburgs didn't marry off their children for love, they did it to annex kingdoms. But fabricated plots often spiral into grand, unfocused schemes. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious anti-Semitic forgery, claimed Jews were plotting to control everything from newspapers to the weather. That's not strategy, it's paranoia dressed up as prophecy. Real power moves are messy, selfish, and rarely as all-encompassing as conspiracy theorists claim. The most dangerous myths aren't the outlandish ones, they're the half-truth wrapped around a kernel of fact. Yes, the Bilderberg Group exists. It's an annual conference where elites discuss global issues behind closed doors. But does that mean they're orchestrating a one-world government? Unlikely. The reality is usually more boring: wealthy people networking to protect their interests. The same goes for the Illuminati. The original 18th century group was a small club of Enlightenment thinkers who wanted to curb church power. They disbanded within a decade, yet centuries later, their name still conjures images of puppet masters pulling strings. The truth: power is rarely that centralized or coordinated. So how can we stay skeptical without sliding into cynicism? Start by asking who benefits from a story. When a viral video claims to expose a secret elite, check who's profiting from the clicks. Follow the money. It's as true now as it was when Renaissance bankers funded both sides of a war. And most importantly, embrace complexity. History isn't a thriller novel with clear villains and heroes. It's a tangled web of competing interests where even the best documented plots have loose ends. The real secret isn't that shadowy groups control everything, it's that no one does, and that's often why the world spirals into chaos. Next time you hear a sensational claim about hidden rulers, remember, extraordinary allegations require extraordinary proof. Because while the truth is often stranger than fiction, it's rarely as tidy or as cinematic, and that's the real conspiracy. The way we'd rather believe in all-powerful villains than face the unsettling truth that sometimes history's worst tragedies happen not because of master plans, but because of greed, incompetence, and the sheer chaos of human ambition. Now that we've peeled back the layers of history's hidden alliances, it's your turn to play detective. Every country has its skeletons in the closet, those whispered deals and buried pacts that never made it into the official textbooks. Start with your own nation's history. Pick an event that always felt a little too neat, a victory or collapse that doesn't quite add up. Maybe it's a sudden political resignation, a suspiciously one-sided treaty, or an economic crisis that benefited a select few. The gaps in the narrative are where the truth hides. First, dig into digitized archives. Many national libraries and universities have uploaded centuries of documents, colonial records, diplomatic cables, even personal letters searchable with a few keystrokes. Look for inconsistencies between public statements and private correspondence. When a leader claims they were forced into a decision, check their inner circle's financial records from that era. Did someone's cousin suddenly acquire land or a lucrative contract? Follow the money. It's the oldest trail in the book. Next, master the art of reading between the lines. Official treaties often bury the real stakes in vague language. Phrases like mutual understanding or special considerations might mask backroom concessions. Compare multiple versions of the same document. If they exist, translations can hide deliberate omissions. And don't overlook footnotes or marginalia. A scribbled note in the corner of a treaty draft could reveal who really brokered the deal. Local newspapers are gold mines for contradictions. While state-run papers parroted the party line, independent presses sometimes slipped in clues. An obituary for a businessman who mysteriously died before testifying in a corruption trial, or a sudden surge in ads for a particular company right before a favorable law passed. These aren't coincidences. They're breadcrumbs. If you hit a wall, think like a spy. Cross-reference timelines. Did a key official take an unexplained trip abroad before a major policy shift? Did rival factions suddenly reconcile after a mysterious intermediary appeared? Even weather reports can be telling. A delay in military movements blamed on storms might conceal negotiations if meteorological records show clear skies that week. The most thrilling finds often come from personal accounts. Diaries, memoirs, or oral histories from minor players. A secretary, a chauffeur, a journalist can reveal what happened offstage. In the 1960s, a butler's memoir exposed how a Caribbean prime minister's heart attack coincided with a missed payment to foreign investors. Sometimes history's biggest secrets are hiding in the smallest voices. So grab your magnifying glass or your smartphone and start sleuthing, because the most powerful tool against historical whitewashing isn't just uncovering the truth. It's realizing how many people worked so hard to bury it, and when you connect those dots, you're not just learning history, you're rewriting